Picture this. October 23, 1944. Rügen Island in the Baltic Sea, where German defenses are crumbling as Soviet forces advance from the east and Allied bombers pound military installations from the west. First Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a 31-year-old U.S. Army nurse serving with the 45th Field Hospital, tends to wounded soldiers in a makeshift medical facility near Sassnitz, evacuated there after her unit was overrun during the rapid Soviet advance through Poland. At 14:47 hours, she radios medical command in liberated France, confirming safe evacuation of critical patients and estimating arrival at designated extraction point within 6 hours. At 14:49 hours, a German civilian approaches Morrison with urgent message about wounded civilians trapped in a cave system on the island's northeastern coast, an area supposedly secured by advancing Soviet forces but where German stragglers and desperate civilians are hiding from the war's final violence. At 14:52 hours, Morrison makes the decision that will define her fate. She tells her medical team she's conducting reconnaissance of the reported location, taking basic supplies in case treatment is needed, and estimating return within 2 hours. For 81 years, First Lieutenant Sarah Morrison will not return from that Baltic island cave. Search parties sent when she fails to reach the extraction point will find the cave entrance she described, but no evidence of Morrison or the wounded civilians she went to help. Just ancient limestone formations and the echo of surf against rock that has witnessed centuries of Baltic storms. Until 2025, when marine archaeologists investigating underwater formations near Rügen discover that the cave system extends far deeper than historical surveys documented, finding sealed chambers containing medical equipment from 1944, documents written in Morrison's handwriting, and evidence that she didn't die on that October day. She discovered something that 3 nations had spent 81 years ensuring stayed buried beneath Baltic waters and German soil. Sarah Morrison wasn't supposed to be in Europe. She'd trained as a nurse in Boston, worked at Massachusetts General Hospital through the Depression years, and joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, motivated by patriotism and professional calling to serve where medical skills were desperately needed. Her assignment had been stateside training facilities, preparing new nurses for overseas deployment while she remained in relative safety coordinating programs that others would execute in combat zones. But in June 1944, immediately after D-Day landings created overwhelming casualties that strained medical resources beyond capacity, Morrison had volunteered for frontline service. Her superiors had initially refused, citing her age and her value as trainer. But Morrison had persisted, arguing that experienced nurses were needed in combat zones more than in training facilities, that younger nurses she'd trained were dying while she remained safe, and that her oath to serve meant nothing if she chose comfort over duty when the need was greatest. She'd arrived in France in July 1944, assigned to the 45th Field Hospital that followed advancing Allied forces providing immediate surgical care for wounded soldiers. Her letters home to her sister Elizabeth in Boston, preserved by family and donated to medical archives in 2018, documented her experiences treating casualties during the brutal fighting across France and into Germany. In September 1944, she'd written words that Elizabeth would reread obsessively for decades. "The wounded we're treating aren't just American. We receive German prisoners who need care, French civilians caught in combat, even Soviet soldiers who've somehow ended up in our sector. The oath we took as nurses doesn't distinguish by nationality. Human suffering transcends politics. But I'm increasingly aware that military authorities view medical care through strategic lenses that sometimes conflict with medical ethics. We save enemy soldiers because Geneva Conventions require it. But we're also gathering intelligence from them, documenting their units and capabilities, treating healing as opportunity for exploitation." Her final letter, mailed on October 21st, contained observations that would haunt investigators for 81 years. "We've been evacuated to Rügen Island, supposedly a safe zone behind Soviet lines where we can treat casualties before they're transported to rear-area hospitals. But this island feels wrong. The Germans defended it heavily, built installations here that our intelligence never fully documented. And the local civilians are terrified, not just of Soviet soldiers, but of something else they won't clearly describe. They mention tunnels beneath the island, facilities that Germans built during the war for purposes nobody will explain. I'm curious but also concerned. Sometimes you can feel when you're in places where terrible things happened, where human choices created darkness that lingers long after those who made the choices have fled. The island of Rügen had indeed been heavily militarized during the war. Germans had built radar stations, coastal artillery positions, and underground facilities designed to protect strategic assets from Allied bombing. By October 1944, as Soviet forces advanced through Poland and approached German territory, many of these installations had been evacuated or destroyed by Germans attempting to deny their use to enemies. But Rügen's cave systems, formed by millennia of Baltic erosion-carving limestone cliffs, had also been used for purposes that military records documented incompletely. Local residents, interviewed after the war, reported that German authorities had sealed certain caves, posted guards preventing civilian access, and conducted operations involving medical personnel and equipment that suggested more than simple storage or defensive preparation. Morrison's decision to investigate the cave on October 23rd had been made based on information from a German civilian woman named Greta Schmidt, a former schoolteacher who approached the American field hospital claiming that dozens of civilians, including children, were trapped in a cave system after Soviet artillery had caused partial collapse blocking their escape route. Schmidt had pleaded for American medical assistance, saying that wounded were dying and that Soviet forces in the area were not providing aid to German civilians they viewed as enemy population. Morrison had reported Schmidt's information to her commanding officer, Major Robert Chen, who'd told her that Soviet authorities were responsible for civilians in their zone, and that American medical personnel conducting operations in Soviet-controlled territory could create diplomatic incidents. But Morrison had argued that medical ethics required assessing the situation regardless of jurisdictional complications. That if civilians were indeed trapped and dying, American nurses couldn't simply ignore them because of political boundaries. Major Chen had reluctantly authorized a reconnaissance mission, giving Morrison 2 hours to assess the situation and report back. If trapped civilians existed and required immediate medical intervention, Chen would contact Soviet authorities requesting permission for American medical team to provide assistance. But Morrison was to conduct only reconnaissance, not treatment, and was to withdraw immediately if the situation appeared dangerous or if Soviet forces objected to American presence. Morrison had departed the field hospital at approximately 14:55 hours on October 23rd, accompanied by Greta Schmidt, who was guiding her to the cave location. According to statements given by medical personnel who'd watched them leave, Morrison had carried basic medical supplies, a flashlight, and a radio for communication with the hospital. She'd estimated return by 1700 hours, allowing time to reach the cave, conduct assessment, and report findings to Major Chen. When 1700 hours passed with no communication from Morrison, Major Chen attempted radio contact. No response. By 1730 hours, he'd organized a search party that reached the cave location Schmidt had described by 1820 hours, finding it exactly as reported, a natural opening in limestone cliffs overlooking the Baltic. But Morrison wasn't there. Neither was Greta Schmidt. The cave entrance showed signs of recent use, footprints in mud suggesting multiple people had entered recently, but no indication of where those people had gone or what had happened after they'd entered. The search party explored the cave's accessible sections, finding natural chambers extending approximately 50 meters into the cliff before narrowing to passages too tight for safe exploration without proper equipment. They called Morrison's name repeatedly, listening for responses that never came. They examined the cave floor for evidence of struggle, collapse, or anything explaining her disappearance. They found nothing conclusive. Major Chen reported Morrison's disappearance to both American and Soviet military authorities. Soviet officers were contacted, asked if their forces had detained American medical personnel for any reason. They denied knowledge of Morrison or operations in the cave area. German civilians in nearby villages were interviewed about Greta Schmidt and about the cave system. Most claimed ignorance, though a few elderly residents mentioned that Germans had been using the caves during the war for purposes they weren't allowed to discuss. The official investigation continued through November 1944, complicated by the war's final desperate months and by Soviet authorities who were increasingly uncooperative with American investigators operating in territories they viewed as their exclusive zone of control. The investigation concluded with a report acknowledging only uncertainty. Morrison had entered the cave and hadn't emerged. No evidence suggested she'd been killed, captured, or evacuated through means investigators could detect. The most likely explanation, authorities reluctantly concluded, was that she'd become lost in the cave system, suffered injury from collapse or fall, and her body remained in passages too dangerous to explore without risking additional casualties. Elizabeth Morrison was notified that her sister was missing in action, presumed killed while providing medical assistance to civilians. She spent the rest of her life searching for answers, writing to military authorities, contacting German officials after the war, even hiring private investigators who found nothing. She died in 1998, still believing that someone knew more about Sarah's fate than they'd admitted, that her sister's disappearance involved something beyond simple accident in an unexplored cave. For 81 years, the cave system on Rügen remained largely unexplored, its deeper sections considered too dangerous for casual exploration and of insufficient scientific interest to justify comprehensive survey. The island transitioned from Soviet occupation to East German control to German reunification, and through all these political changes, the caves witnessed only occasional visits from adventurous tourists and local historians documenting wartime history. In 2024, a team of marine archaeologists from the University of Rostock began studying underwater formations along Rügen's coastline, investigating how sea level changes had affected coastal caves over millennia. Using modern sonar and underwater drones, they discovered that many cave systems extended far below current water levels, connecting to submerged passages that had been dry land during previous geological periods. On January 19, 2025, while exploring one such system near the cave where Sarah Morrison had vanished, the team detected an anomaly. A section of cave wall approximately 70 meters from the entrance showed acoustic properties suggesting artificial construction behind natural limestone. Further investigation revealed that the wall was recent work, probably mid-20th century, built to conceal whatever lay beyond it. German authorities were contacted, informed about the discovery, and asked whether the sealed section might contain wartime materials requiring careful handling. Archival searches revealed Morrison's disappearance and its connection to this cave system. Both German and American governments agreed that the wall should be carefully breached to determine what it concealed. On February 14, 2025, exactly 81 years after Morrison's disappearance, excavation specialists carefully removed the concealing wall, revealing a steel door bearing both German military and Red Cross markings. What lay beyond that door would finally answer questions about First Lieutenant Sarah Morrison's disappearance and reveal why a Baltic island cave had mattered enough in 1944 that an American nurse's investigation of it had resulted in her vanishing from historical record for more than 8 decades. The steel door opened into a treatment center that no military records from any nation acknowledged had existed. German and American investigation teams descended into chambers approximately 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, carved from limestone and reinforced with concrete that bore both Wehrmacht engineering stamps and International Red Cross markings. The facility had been deliberately constructed, equipped with medical technology sophisticated for 1944, and sealed with such care that 81 years of Baltic weather and geological activity had never compromised its integrity. The treatment center's organization suggested it had served purposes transcending standard military medicine. One section contained surgical equipment, operating tables, and instruments that matched what field hospitals used. But another section held medical research apparatus, laboratory equipment for studying diseases and developing treatments, and documentation suggesting this facility had been conducting work that combined immediate patient care with long-term medical advancement. The investigation team's first discovery was a nurse's station near the facility's entrance, containing a journal bearing Sarah Morrison's name and U.S. Army Nurse Corps' identification. The journal began on October 23, 1944, at 15:08 hours, just minutes after Morrison had entered the cave following Greta Schmidt. Entered cave as described. Schmidt led me past natural chambers to concealed passage that opens into constructed facility. This isn't a civilian shelter. It's a medical treatment center, German-built but operating under international medical protocols. Schmidt reveals she's actually Dr. Greta Schmidt, German physician who's been coordinating what she calls the Hippocratic Sanctuary, a program providing medical care to casualties from all sides without regard to military affiliation. The subsequent entries documented what happened during Morrison's first hours in the facility, revelations that explained everything about her disappearance. 1,547 hours. Dr. Schmidt has shown me through this facility. There are wounded here, German soldiers certainly, but also Soviet casualties, Polish civilians, even 2 British airmen whose plane was shot down weeks ago. They're all receiving care from medical staff representing multiple nationalities. German doctors working alongside a Czech nurse, a Soviet physician treating German patients, an American medic who was captured months ago but who chose to remain here providing care rather than be sent to POW camp. Morrison's journal revealed her growing understanding that the Hippocratic Sanctuary represented something unprecedented in wartime medical practice. 1,632 hours. Dr. Schmidt explains that this facility was established in 1943 by medical professionals from multiple nations who believed the Hippocratic Oath transcended military loyalty. They've been operating throughout the war, treating casualties that military authorities from all sides either couldn't or wouldn't treat. German deserters who would be executed if returned to their units. Soviet soldiers who would be sent to gulags if repatriated because Stalin views capture as treason. Civilians from occupied territories who fall between jurisdictional cracks where no one takes responsibility for their care. The journal documented Morrison's internal struggle with this revelation over hours spent in the facility throughout the evening of October 23rd. Schmidt had explained that medical personnel from German, Soviet, American, British, and other militaries had been coordinating through neutral intermediaries throughout the war, creating sanctuaries where the oath to heal transcended the obligation to serve national military objectives. The sanctuaries operated with tacit knowledge of medical commands from multiple nations, all recognizing that some casualties required care that military field hospitals either couldn't provide due to resource constraints or wouldn't provide due to political considerations. But Morrison's journal also documented her discovery that the sanctuary program involved accepting casualties that might die without treatment, but whom military authorities had classified as low priority or expendable. October 23, 2,147 hours. I've spent 9 hours here now. Schmidt has shown me patients who were triaged as unsalvageable by military medicine, sent to die because saving them would consume resources needed for soldiers who could return to combat. But sanctuary physicians refuse to accept that calculus. They argue that medical ethics requires treating all patients regardless of strategic military value, that the moment medicine becomes tool of warfare rather than healing profession, it betrays everything the Hippocratic tradition represents. Morrison had been given the same choice that other medical professionals had faced when they'd discovered sanctuary operations. Leave, report finding a civilian shelter requiring Soviet humanitarian assistance, and return to her unit. Or remain as American representative, providing care to patients while monitoring the sanctuary to ensure its operations didn't threaten U.S. military objectives, and serving as liaison with Army Medical Corps handlers who'd be contacted through channels that protected both military command and medical staff from complications if arrangements became known. Morrison's decision, documented in entries from October 24th through October 26th, explained why she'd never returned to the 45th Field Hospital. October 26th, 14:23 hours. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value American interests. Because I believe medical care that serves healing rather than warfare honors my nursing oath more truly than field hospital work that treats soldiers as weapons to be repaired and returned to combat. I'll serve as American representative, monitoring the sanctuary while providing care that transcends national boundaries. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Morrison had indeed remained in the Rugen facility for years after her reported disappearance. A second journal, covering the period from 1944 to 1952, revealed that Morrison had lived in the cave sanctuary throughout the war's final months and into the early Cold War, treating patients from all sides of conflicts that officially ended in 1945, but which continued in forms that governments preferred not to acknowledge publicly. This second journal painted a detailed picture of Morrison's life in the sanctuary during post-war years, treating wounded from conflicts that Cold War narratives insisted weren't happening, Soviet deserters fleeing Stalin's purges, German refugees escaping both Soviet occupation and Western denazification, Polish resistance fighters injured in battles against communist authorities, and occasionally American or British servicemen whose presence in Eastern Europe couldn't be officially acknowledged because it would reveal intelligence operations that violated agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam. The journal documented Morrison's growing expertise in treating injuries that military field hospitals never saw, casualties from intelligence operations, resistance activities, and conflicts that existed in shadows between official peace and admitted warfare. She developed techniques for treating torture injuries without leaving evidence that medical care had been provided. She learned to perform surgery that enabled patients to assume new identities, altering distinguishing features that might reveal their past affiliations. And most significantly, she became expert in what she termed ethical triage, making decisions about who received care based solely on medical need rather than military value or political affiliation. But the journal also documented immense challenges: complete isolation from family and friends who believed she'd died, inability to maintain connections with nursing colleagues who would have supported her through the trauma of treating casualties that tested every limit of medical capability and ethical reasoning, growing awareness that her sister Elizabeth was searching desperately for answers about her fate, while she lived just hundreds of kilometers away, unable to make contact without compromising the sanctuary's security. The entries from the late 1940s showed a woman wrestling with depression and moral exhaustion. March 17, 1949. I've been in this cave 4.5 years. 4.5 years of treating wounds that official wars didn't cause, saving lives that official histories won't acknowledge, serving purposes that transcend nations, but which nations tacitly support because someone must do the work that military medicine can't admit exists. Dr. Schmidt argues that we're preserving medical ethics in a world where politics increasingly corrupts every profession, including medicine. But I'm exhausted. And I'm increasingly convinced that serving higher principles while abandoning personal relationships creates a kind of isolation that corrupts as surely as political compromise corrupts. The journal revealed that Morrison had requested release from sanctuary duty in 1951. Arguing that she'd served longer than most representatives and that the sanctuary was well enough established that her continued presence wasn't essential. The sanctuary's coordinating committee had agreed, with conditions reflecting both appreciation for her service and recognition that medical personnel who'd served too long in such conditions sometimes became unable to reintegrate into conventional medical practice. She'd be given new identity, relocated to a country with minimal U.S. military medical presence, and provided with support allowing her to work in civilian medicine. She'd maintain contact with sanctuary networks throughout her life, available for consultation when complex cases required her unique expertise. But she'd no longer serve as active representative in facilities that existed in the spaces between official militaries and acknowledged conflicts. Morrison's final journal entry as sanctuary representative was dated August 23, 1952. Tomorrow I leave Rugen. I'll become Margaret Collins, Canadian nurse who emigrated from Europe after working in displaced persons camps during post-war chaos. The identity is plausible. Documentation shows me employed at facilities that existed but which kept minimal records. I'll live in Vancouver, work in civilian hospitals if credentials can be arranged, and try to build life from fragments of identities I've abandoned. Elizabeth will never know I survived. My colleagues at Massachusetts General will never learn what became of me. And I'll spend remaining years wondering if saving lives without regard to nationality justified abandoning the sister who needed to know I hadn't died alone in a Baltic cave. The investigation team found documentation of Morrison's reintegration in files that Sanctuary Network successors had maintained with remarkable organizational continuity. She'd lived in Vancouver under her assumed identity from 1952 until her death in 1996 at age 83. She'd worked as emergency room nurse at Vancouver General Hospital, earned reputation for exceptional skill with trauma cases, and maintained low profile despite insights into treating injuries that few civilian nurses understood. She'd never married, never formed close relationships requiring explanation of gaps in her history, and never revealed her actual identity even to colleagues who became friends over decades of working together. She'd maintained contact with Sanctuary Network coordinators throughout her life, providing consultation on complex medical ethics cases and occasionally traveling to facilities that continued operating in various forms. And significantly, she'd written a memoir in her final years intended for eventual release explaining what the Hippocratic Sanctuary had been and why she'd believed serving it honored nursing oaths more truly than conventional military medicine. That memoir, discovered among documents in the cave facility, provided the most comprehensive explanation of wartime medical cooperation that investigators had ever received. Morrison argued that the Hippocratic Oath's requirement to heal transcended national loyalty, that medical professionals who allowed military strategy to override ethical obligations betrayed their profession's fundamental principles. The Sanctuary program had been medical profession's attempt to preserve healing as primary objective even when military authorities viewed medicine primarily as tool for maintaining combat effectiveness. She acknowledged moral complications, arguments that could be made that she'd betrayed her military oath by providing care to enemy casualties and by operating outside official channels. But she also argued that medical ethics ultimately served all nations by preserving human life, regardless of political affiliation. That narrow military advantage meant nothing if the price was transforming medicine from healing profession into adjunct of warfare. The most poignant documents in the cave were letters Morrison had written to Elizabeth throughout her years in the sanctuary and in Vancouver. Letters she'd never sent but which documented her continuing connection to the sister she'd abandoned. The letters explained her choices, described her work treating casualties from conflicts that official histories ignored, and asked forgiveness for pain her disappearance had caused. The final letter, dated November 3, 1995, just months before Morrison's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. Elizabeth, if you're reading this, someone discovered these letters after my death and decided you deserved truth despite security classifications. I disappeared in 1944 because I found medical practice that transcended military boundaries and made a choice that I spent 51 years questioning. I became Margaret Collins and lived a life that had meaning, but which was built on deception that corrupted everything, including the relationships I claimed to value. I treated wounded from wars that governments denied existed while abandoning the sister who needed to know I hadn't died providing care to strangers. Whether that exchange was justified, whether the lives I saved balanced the relationship I destroyed, I honestly don't know. I chose professional ethics over personal loyalty, and I paid for that choice every day since October 1944. The German government's response to the facility's discovery followed now familiar patterns. The site was classified at highest security levels, contents were cataloged under protocols ensuring minimal access, and diplomatic consultations were held with American, Russian, and other governments about handling evidence of arrangements none had publicly acknowledged. Consensus emerged that the facility would be described as medical shelter from World War II, now of historical but not current significance, and that truth about Hippocratic sanctuary and Morrison's fate would remain classified indefinitely. But Morrison's family was contacted. Given partial information, authorities determined was deserved and safe. In April 2025, Elizabeth Morrison's granddaughter Jennifer received notification from U.S. Army Nurse Corps. First Lieutenant Morrison had disappeared in 1944, but not through capture or accident. She'd discovered a classified medical facility, had remained to provide care under circumstances requiring her official death, and had lived until 1996 under assumed identity in Canada. Jennifer was given access to some of Morrison's letters, written to Elizabeth but never sent, documenting her life as Margaret Collins and her enduring connection to family she'd abandoned. She was shown portions of Morrison's memoir, explaining her choices and principles she'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity for medical ethics. And she was told, in carefully crafted language, that her great-aunt had served purposes transcending military medicine, that her sacrifice had contributed to preserving medical ethics during a period when warfare increasingly corrupted healing professions, and that she'd never stopped regretting pain her disappearance had caused. The cave facility on Rügen was sealed before any public announcement about its discovery. German authorities installed a small marker near the cave entrance, acknowledging that American military nurse Sarah Morrison had disappeared at this location in 1944, giving her life in service to medical ideals that authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. But among those few who knew complete truth, who'd read Morrison's journals and understood what Hippocratic sanctuary represented, there was acknowledgement that World War II medical history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some medical professionals had served purposes transcending military medicine, that preserving healing as primary medical objective had sometimes required arrangements outside official channels, and that the line between serving military interests and serving medical ethics had been contested in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. First Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had walked into a Baltic cave on October 23, 1944, and vanished into a world where medical care transcended national boundaries and military objectives. She'd spent 8 years in the Rügen Sanctuary and 44 years in Vancouver carrying secrets that would remain buried for 81 years before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen medical ethics over family, healing over nationality, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The secrets revealed in the Rügen cave weren't crimes but choices, not betrayals but sacrifices made by medical professionals who believed that the Hippocratic Oath required commitments that military service couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Morrison's choice to serve the sanctuary was ethical, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Jennifer Morrison and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was at least understanding that disappearance had meant something beyond death, that sacrifice had served purposes transcending individual nations, and that sometimes greatest service involved giving up everything to protect principles that no nation owned but all humanity needed, preserved for understanding how healing professions survived warfare's corrupting influence. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.